Okay, good morning everyone. Before we start, basic rules apply. Please shut off your cell phones. And we're outside without a microphone, so I'm going to give you my parade ground voice, and hopefully it carries above the traffic and the lawnmowers. So good morning and welcome everyone to today's event, the dedication of a marker as part of the Stopping Stones project near the site where the African-American woman Margaret Bowen, who was known as Peg, lived and worked while enslaved in Bennington from 1772 to 1778. My name is Martin Mahoney, and I serve as the executive director of the Bennington Museum that is located less than 1/4 of a mile from where we stand today. The Bennington Museum is committed to telling the stories of all the people of Bennington County. This commitment includes the stories of the displaced, subjugated, oftentimes forgotten, or purposely pushed aside, and yes, the enslaved people that lived and participated in all aspects of life in our area. This event and the countless hours of work that went into the research and coordination of this marker is in a small way a means of displaying that commitment to the public. I would briefly like to thank those who helped bring this project to fruition. Of course, those are friends of the Stopping Stones project, Paul Growald and Sophia Babbitt, Historic New England and the Herbert and Louise Whitney Fund, Ben & Jerry's Foundation, the staff at the Bennington Museum, and the volunteer researchers, especially Callie Raspuzzi, the museum's registrar, and Carolyn Duffy, who did a tremendous amount of work on this project, as well as Dina Mallory, the museum educator who put this event together and also worked in a number of ways to make sure that today happened. Our volunteers, the Village of Old Bennington, Elizabeth and Graham Moore, who are the homeowners that we're standing in front of, Tetro Concrete Impressions, Cat TV, and today's speakers. We have an impressive lineup today. Besides Paul Growald, we have Mia Schultz, Dr. Lisa Downing-Forget, Dr. Alfredo Medina, and Jonathan Phipps. And I also want to thank everyone else for coming. Today's attendees come and share a deep understanding that by embracing a more varied and nuanced interpretation of history, we are not discarding older interpretations, but adding more tools to our toolkit to tell a much deeper and fuller story. It is now my pleasure to introduce the social and business entrepreneur, philanthropist, engagement artist, activist, and founder of the Stopping Stones Project, Paul Growald.
Thank you, Martin. Now, I'm not using the microphone, I realized. So I've been told I need to project my voice just in normal conversation, so this is giving me some good practice time. So thank you, Martin. I appreciate all of you coming today and to honor the life and the memory of Margaret Peg Bowen. She lived and worked here about 250 years ago. Because she was enslaved, until this day, she had nothing to honor her life and memory. Can you all hear me back there? Good. So to craft the Stopping Stones memorial we are installing today, and I'll show it to you right now, I hand-stamped her name letter by letter and repeated it as I was saying so, often with tears in my eyes. I have a very personal connection to this. You might have a question about, so why did I get involved? What inspired me to initiate the Stopping Stones ceremony and project? My family came from Germany, my mother's family. She grew up there, and until the Nazi regime compelled them to flee, eventually to the United States. The Nazis later murdered all but one of their relatives among the millions of more who couldn't or chose not to leave. And I visited the homes of three generations of my mother's family over a number of times, and the most recently most recent one I was there, the mayor of the town that my grandmother came from, along with the city council, sponsored the installation of what's called a Stolpersteiner there, which is very much like this, which I have copied. And I grew up having quite a bit of anger and resentment over the Holocaust and what happened. But the process of having it recognized personally to me and the representation of those people, that this German artist whose father was a World War II German army soldier, was deeply moving to me and also deeply healing. And I asked myself after that, so what's the meaning of this for me as an American? And I realized that in contrast to Germany, where there are all kinds of memorials and education in schools and so forth, my own country had done almost nothing to recognize those individuals who were enslaved here. And so I decided, I then learned a lot about the history of slavery in the United States and the contributions, the uncompensated contributions that those millions of people made to our country. And so I decided, okay, bring this memorial process with local sponsorship to the United States. I then learned that when slavery existed, that uncompensated work, the blood, sweat, and tears of enslaved individuals resulted in about 60% of the economic activity in early America. So think about that. That's the equivalent today, equaling to all banks, all manufacturing, electronics, and transportation combined. So slavery wasn't a sideshow in American history. It was actually the main reason our country developed from about number 28 in the world economically to number 2 in only 20 years. Because of that, the production and the support of people just for their basic needs who were enslaved. Yet the prosperity that those enslaved individuals created still excludes their descendants today. The average wealth of a black person in this country is about 2%, 2 cents for every dollar of that owned by white people in this country. So think about it for a moment. What's your overall net worth? And then what would 2% of that be? We have some company across the street. So today the echoes of slavery still rumble loudly in the lives of black people with underemployment and poverty, high COVID infection and death rates and other health problems, education gaps, police abuses, mass incarceration, and the daily microaggressions that they experience. The list goes on and on. So the question is, what can you do as individuals? And I would encourage you to get involved with organizations in this area and throughout the state that are doing something to address that history and repair the ongoing disparities that exist. So among the groups you could get involved with are the Rutland area NAACP chapter that Mia Schultz heads, the Bennington Center for Restorative Justice, the Greater Bennington Peace and Justice Center, the Vermont Racial Equity Alliance, and if you happen to be a student, the Vermont Student Anti-Racism Network. So I call on all of you who, like me, are troubled by these disgraces and this history to work together with one of these organizations to create positive anti-racism actions that yield concrete results. So get involved in this long overdue work, and I can tell you it's very gratifying. It's one of the most meaningful things that I have ever done. It's also very healing and a great way to connect with others who share those concerns. So now I invite Callie Raspuzzi, the collections manager of the Bennington Museum, who will discuss some of her and Carolyn Duffy's research and others. I gather there were many volunteers involved in this process to tell you about history of Margaret Peg Bowen.
Hello, everyone. So the death of slavery was painfully slow and uneven in this country, even in northern states like Vermont. Slavery was well established in New England in the 1700s, and some of the earliest white settlers brought enslaved black people with them when they came to Bennington. Among the enslavers in Bennington was our famous proprietor of the Catamount Tavern and supporter of the Green Mountain Boys, Stephen Fay. In 1772, Fay purchased 2 enslaved people from Hadley, Massachusetts, Pomp Morgan and Margaret Bowen, who was called Peg. Finding information about Peg and Pomp and other enslaved people has been challenging. Black people in early America were often denied basic rights that would have led to them being included in public records. We have not found anything yet about the lives of these 2 people here in Bennington. What we know is from private diaries, receipts, and memorandum books that were saved by their enslavers in Massachusetts. And we do owe a great debt of thanks to Carolyn Duffy, who has helped us tremendously with this research. We know that Peg was acquired by Moses Porter in Hadley, Massachusetts in 1754 at the age of 12. After his death, she continued to be enslaved by members of his family. She had 2 daughters, Rose, born in 1761, and Phyllis, born in 1765. In May of 1771, Pomp Morgan requested that the town clerk in Hadley record his engagement to Peg. They needed the consent of both of their enslavers in order to marry, which Pomp's enslaver refused to give. Peg seems to have had more agency. In August of 1771, she went out for herself, which was an arrangement in which she worked for another family, but her enslavers collected her wages. She may have been allowed to keep a portion of the money, or she might have simply sought this arrangement in order to be nearer to her intended spouse. They were still not allowed to live together, as far as we know, but nearly a year later, a solution presented itself. Stephen Fay in Bennington would purchase both Peg and Pomp together. Presumably at this point, Pomp's enslaver had given in. And at this point, it appears that Peg was given another choice. She could go to Vermont with her lover, or she could stay in Massachusetts with her children. Rose and Phyllis were 11 and 7 years old at that time. She chose her husband. We know very little about Peg's life here in Bennington. Back in Hadley, her daughter Rose gave birth in 1775, and 3 days later, her other daughter Phyllis died of tuberculosis, and the new baby was named after her. Peg did not meet her granddaughter until she was sold back to Charles Phipps in 1778. We do not know what happened to Pomp Morgan. He might have died in Bennington. He might have been sold to another enslaver. Perhaps he managed to gain his freedom. Slavery was controversial in colonial America, particularly as the colonists started to fight for freedom from England. There were some who acknowledged the unfree black people in their midst. Vermont declared itself an independent republic in 1777, after years of wrangling between New Hampshire and New York over this territory. Its new constitution, signed July 8, 1777, abolished adult slavery. Vermont was the first future state to take a step like this, and Vermonters are justly proud of this fact. However, if you're paying attention, you'll notice that the Vermont Constitution abolished adult slavery in 1777, but Peg, who was in her 30s, was enslaved here through 1778. the Vermont Constitution was not a perfectly effective emancipation document. Many Vermonters were at best ambivalent about slavery, and some were also ambivalent about the Republic of Vermont. This ambivalence towards slavery even applies to the writers of that Constitution. Stephen Fay's son Jonas was the primary author of the Constitution, signed July 8, 1777. But on March 6, 1778, nearly a year later, he signed the receipt witnessing the sale of Peg from Stephen Fay of Bennington, Vermont, to Charles Phipps of Hadley, Massachusetts. There are other examples of Vermonters enslaving Black people after 1777, and there are also examples of Vermonters who actively fought against slavery and tried to make the Constitution's rhetoric into reality. It is important to recognize that the abolition of slavery was never a foregone conclusion. Social progress did not happen in this country as part of a natural course of events. Progress happened because of the choices that individual people made and the hard work that they did. There have been many setbacks along the way. Peg, enslaved in Bennington despite the declaration of the 1777 Vermont Constitution, was not manumitted until 1782 in Massachusetts. Now, we cannot change the past, but we can acknowledge that slavery happened here, and we can be inspired by people who continue to fight against racism. And with that, I would like to introduce Mia Schultz, the president of the Rutland chapter of the NAACP.
Are we doing the stone? Yeah. Okay. This is the stone. Margaret Peg Bowen, enslaved here, 1772 to 1778. With the placing of this stopping stone, we remember the life of Margaret Bowen and acknowledge her unrecognized and uncompensated work and contributions to our community's history. So, let's stage. I have to say that this is pretty emotional for me. I didn't know all of those things about Peg. So give me a moment and I'm gonna get adjusted and put my glasses on. So first, I would like to acknowledge the Mohican ancestors, present and past, who were the original caretakers of this unceded land that we are occupying here today. My name is Mia Schultz, and I am the president of the Rutland area NAACP, which also covers Bennington and Addison counties. And the vision of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People is to ensure a society in which all individuals have equal rights without discrimination based on race. And I am a volunteer. And in that capacity, I support many people in this community when they have experienced racial harm, violence, and discrimination. I sit with wives and children who've lost their beloved family members for inexplicably, seemingly discriminatory reasons. I counsel with parents of students who are contemplating suicide because of the unmitigated, unchecked abuse in our schools. And we also organize spaces of joy and community and safety. So in that spirit, today, I wanted to, instead of giving you all a speech, send a letter to Margaret Peg Bowen, because I felt in my capacity, that is who I want to speak to today. So, dear Margaret Peg Bowen, I speak your name and I bring you into our space today. I claim you and I honor you as my ancestor. I give thanks to you and I shed tears for you. I'm thankful that you existed as you had to endure unimaginable circumstances. And while I cannot understand the breadth of the horrors that you encountered, I give voice to you today. I thank you for your sacrifice. Because whatever it is that I am and all that I am because you were. And we cannot imagine our futures without recognizing the atrocities of the past. And we now look back 245 years since Vermont constitutionally abolished slavery. But many claim that this made a way for equality with the adoption of this ban in our Constitution. But there were clauses which framed exceptions, and 88 years later, those exceptions were applied in a different way in the 13th Amendment of the United States of America, which federally abolished slavery. History does not tell us the lies and the tricks and the policies and the politics that occurred then and still occur now. Today, we do not know the terrorism that you experienced in your life, but we know that the foundation of slavery has now been manifested in systemic and systematic racism that we continue to endure. I know that I am a future that you likely did not envision. And two, I am grateful to know that there's a better future that I cannot fathom. And if I were to conjure a vision of a future, I see your children's children's children across the ages transforming what we know today and experience today. Ancestor Margaret Peg Bowen, I'm grateful for you and humbled for the opportunity to say Salvona, words of our ancestors, meaning I see you. And today, as we place this stone permanently in the ground, we say that you matter. Today, we say your name. Even if it's a name that was not originally intended for you, others will now walk by and see this stone, and they too will say your name. And for that, I rejoice. With gratitude, Mia. I gotta introduce the next person. All right. I'm gonna be honest, I was feeling really emotional about this letter. My grandmother just passed away. She was my connection to my ancestors. And so I feel our ancestors here today. And so that's where I'm at here. Really emotional, pretty sensitive. But next on our list, we have on the page, Dr. Lisa Downing Forget, co-chair of the Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Belonging Committee of Southwestern Vermont Healthcare. Thank you.
So I thought a lot about PEG as well. And I thought that just days ago, we celebrated the first national recognition of Juneteenth, the end of slavery in the United States. And today, we are here 250 years later on the same spot that Peg was enslaved. And I doubt that Peg could have imagined such a day. I doubt she ever thought that she would be memorialized or remembered at all. Like most people living in Vermont during this period, her greatest concern was likely just staying alive. I wonder how often she thought about what it would like to be free and what that would really mean for her and her family. But free or not, her life was not an easy one. When Peg was alive, the average life expectancy for African Americans was between 25 and 35 years old. A single woman had the right to own property and control her own economy, but this was generally not acceptable for a woman and not practical. Marriage was the only way most women could ensure their survival. They were expected to get married and bear children and had no legal recourse if their husband treated them inappropriately. Once a woman married, her husband legally owned all of her property and had control over any income or wages she brought in. Women were relegated to the home. For free blacks, that usually consisted of one room with no electricity, no indoor plumbing, and an open hearth to cook and provide heat. Sometimes no windows, and certainly no screens. There were no vacuums, no microwaves, no tractors. The job was physical and often hard, up before sunrise and to bed after sundown. 1 in 5 women died in childbirth. Deliveries were sometimes attended by a midwife who may or may not have been trained in her trade and who most certainly did not wash her hands. 25% of all children did not make it to the 12-month-old mark, and 50% did not make it to 5 years old. At that time, there were no doctors, no hospitals, and none of the modern medical advances we have today. You did not need a medical degree to proclaim yourself as a doctor. Most doctors or practitioners peddled medicines compounded with alcohol or opium as a cure for all illnesses. There was no germ theory. Even apprentice doctors believed that illnesses came from humors or noxious fumes from the environment, and their cures consisted of bloodletting, enemas, and emetics. The most common cause of death during Peg's life was infection, all of which can be cured now, and injury. African Americans, like most Americans, took care of their own health care needs with treatments that had been passed down by generations or remedies from their own gardens. It was not until 1808 when a federal ban on importing slaves led to an investment by slaveholders to have doctors attend the births of their slave children, because they were no longer allowed to import people to work in their businesses. Unfortunately, we know the same doctors, all white men, took advantage of slave women and experimented on them without their permission. For example, a prominent physician in the field of gynecology who invented the speculum and the first cure for a vaginal vesicular fistula experimented on slave people to understand how to come up with these inventions without their permission, without anesthetics, even though anesthetics were available at the time. It is no wonder why so many African Americans today have a deep distrust of medicine. On top of unethical experiments, there is substantial evidence that African Americans continue to receive poorer health care and have poorer health outcomes. Even today, Black women are 4 to 5 times more likely to die in childbirth, have higher rates of infant mortality, and shorter life expectancy. It was almost 100 years after Peg's death that the Civil War ended and the Freedmen's Hospital was established to care for newly freed slaves. 2 years after that, Dr. Rebecca Lee Crumbler became the first Black woman to earn her medical degree from the New England Female Medical College in Boston, the only African American in her class. Of course, even she still did not have the right to vote. And despite Dr. Crumbler's success, African Americans were systematically excluded from becoming physicians and joining medical associations. But despite all these tribulations, we have come a long way. Our lives are safer, longer, and physically less demanding than 250 years ago. But many of us still experience the same discriminations as Peg 250 years later. So I wonder, how would Peg feel about all of this today, if she could see us now from wherever her spirit resides? I'm sure during her lifetime, she might have even considered herself lucky to have a roof over her head, food in her belly, a husband, the ability to travel, the opportunity to have children. And sometimes a quiet, comfortable life is all we long for. We may want to shut out the problems that we see in the world, and it is easier to worry about the day-to-day tasks that we must accomplish. But if we take a step back, look at our world, listen to our hearts, we can dream of a society and a world that gives us all the same opportunities. And if we think of the potential in us, we may realize that we too are people who deserve to be remembered. Thank you. And now I would like to introduce Dr. Alfredo Medina, Vice President for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion and College Diversity Officer at Bennington College.
First, let me just acknowledge Sister Mia and Sister Lisa for your words, your knowledge, your education. Because when I was thinking about Margaret Peg, I was thinking black women today. Is this working? It's for the video. Oh, it is. I'll for the video. All right. And so I started thinking about everything that not only that Margaret Bowen must have faced, as horrific as it is. I did stop and think, well, how far have we come? And while 250 years later, we have come a long way. In many ways, we believe that with chattel slavery no longer being part of the way we operate in the United States, we're operating under new Jim Crow. We're operating under a system, under policies that disproportionately continue to impact black bodies in America. And I thought to myself, well, what would Margaret want me to share? And share it with who? And so, because I know how emotional this was for Lisa, I know how emotional this was for Mia, and I know how emotional it's going to be for Jonathan. This is emotional for me. Whenever we are talking about issues like this, we have to always remember that we carry an emotional burden with us. Because not only do we have to relive and re-traumatize ourselves by talking about these issues, we also have to understand that we're doing it in a way to ensure that we're advancing anti-racism. But that burden can really be hard to carry. So I thought to myself, who does Peg really want me to speak to? And so I am going to speak today directly to non-black folk in the audience, because I think this is the message that I think that Margaret would want to hear. And I think about James Baldwin, right? That not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it's faced. Okay, and so the first thing we have to do is begin to reckon our history, but we ask, what is that we can be doing today? That we don't want to relive 245 years later of the same issues that are now differently coded in our policies and our systems. And so the first thing I know, when Paul was talking about ways that we can contribute back, the first thing I would say is that a key word here is uncompensated. Many of us who do this work are uncompensated. And by that I mean black bodies in America today are not receiving their fair wages. The wealth capacity is just, I would say, unequivocally, disproportionately nowhere near that of white wealth. We talk about ways and like just dealing with issues of reproductive health, and you bring up Dr. Sims and everything that's happened. And just yesterday with the overturning of Roe versus Wade, understand that while it is going to impact all women disproportionately, it's going to wreak havoc on black bodies. And so what is it I can tell you today? The first thing is continue to make financial commitments, right, to black causes. And not just organizations, but directly to individuals, to artists, to creatives, to activists. Because at the end of the day, when we make contributions, sometimes those dollars don't make it into their pockets. And we want to ensure that while we're out there making sure that we're trying to close that financial gap, I can say to you that one of the issues why we have so many struggles in America today, and I'm sure that Peg would probably want others to want to sort of make sure that her legacy is not in vain, is to find ways that you, in your capacity, whether it be through your own activism, whether it be through your own capacity of where you work, or your own, or if there are policymakers here, I think I do see Brian out there in the audience, who, again, through your legislation, is look at ways where we can begin to look at policies that can help to sort of close that gap, so that black folks are not out there always struggling. A big issue that we also deal with, and I know Peg probably didn't have access to this. I'm sure that many black folks here don't have access to this. And I can tell you that it's an issue of cost and accessibility, and that is mental health services. Okay. I think about Joy DeGruy, and I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with the author of Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome. She said it best. Although slavery has been a part of human history, American chattel slavery represents a case of human trauma incomparable in scope, duration, and consequence to any other incident of human enslavement. We're carrying that trauma through our generations today. So while Peg, as one of our ancestors, right, and through her stories, we want to continue pushing forward, we also are carrying a lot of trauma. So what can we be doing? The first thing is, again, to revisit policies and legislation to ensure that there is access for Black folks to have access to mental health services, that they are also looking at ways that you can also to ensure that through your capacity and through your privilege are creating avenues for that to happen. Again, you may say, well, how do I do that? Think about your own experiences and how you access services, and how are you willing to make sure that you can give up some of your privilege and your power to ensure that Black folks are having access to the same rights, what I consider basic human rights, that you're afforded. I think the other thing that Peg would want from all of this is to ensure that moving forward, that we are amplifying and centering Black women. We talk about enslavement, but we are living in modern day slavery. We think about mass incarceration. More than 1/3 of Black people are incarcerated in this country. That means their voting rights are taken from them, which means they are in many ways hampered by the decisions and the policies that are often passed where they have no voice. So if we are going to do something and to honor Peg, right, moving forward, and that is really to take the work that you're doing, take your privilege and take your power and ensure that you are dismantling these systems and these policies, that we want to ensure that Peg and Peg's ancestors and myself and Mia and Lisa and Jonathan and every other Black folks that are here in Bennington do not have to ever think about when we come in here and we work and we contribute our dollars, that we feel safe and we feel seen and we feel proud. And that's the folks that's the voice. I believe that's what Peg would want me to be telling you as we today assemble together as a community, because part of community is reckoning with our past, but also owning it, and what are you planning to do to move from intention to impact. Thank you. And now I want to introduce Brother Jonathan Phipps, Equity Coordinator for Southwestern Vermont Supervisory Union.
So I want to thank every one of you want to be loud, okay? So I get to finally be loud, yay. So everybody always tells me to lower your voice. So I want to thank all the previous speakers, and Dr. Medina's speech is actually a good segue into what I'm going to talk about. So my job is the equity coordinator for the SVSU, the local school consortium, you could call it. My job is essentially making sure all of our schools are inclusive and equitable for all students, regardless of their identity or demographic. This effort is difficult, though, due to the overwhelming power of history. I would like to talk about history. History, I'm a former history teacher. Now I get to teach history. I'm happy. First thing I want to say is Peg was not that far back. I'm 36 years old. I had my son when I was 32. My father had me when he was 31. So for simplicity's sake for now, we're going to call every 30 years a Phipps generation. Just remember this, okay? A mere 2 Phipps generations ago, that's 60 years. That's 1962. Both my parents were long in existence. They were probably playing on playgrounds and, I don't know, whatever they did. But I want you to keep in mind something. The Civil Rights Act, as we know them today, were passed in 1964 and 1968. They were born without these. Meaning my mother and father were both born at a time where it was still acceptable to discriminate against people politically, socially, and legally. And although the Equal Employment Opportunity of 1972 came into impact, it was not until 1991, my lifetime, when the Civil Rights Act of 1991 strengthened the Equal Employment Opportunity Act, making it accessible for people to gain damages and restitution for being discriminated against in employment. Wow, okay. Let's go back a mere 3 Phipps generations, 90 years. The year's now 1932. Somebody check my math, I'm really bad at math. This is the era of my grandparents. They knew nothing of anything that my parents benefited from or went through. In fact, Brown versus Board of Education would not occur until 1954, meaning in their education, they were separate and unequal. My mother would be able to get one of her fancy degrees, but that was not afforded until the non-discrimination clauses of my time. We had to fight for it. The military did not desegregate until 1948. Ooh, okay, so my dad benefits, but not my grandfather. Even so, benefits were not equally afforded when it was desegregated. This means that my grandparents who served could not benefit from their service. I want you to really think about that one. Moreover, my father, who also did serve, you could make a very clear argument. We now understand that even he did not benefit fully from his service. He was not able to access the full spectrum of benefits that may have been afforded to somebody else due to the color of his skin. And there's only been a recent acknowledgement to the innate bias of this. This past Saturday, we celebrated Juneteenth at the middle school. We had an event. Juneteenth was Sunday. We had the event on Saturday. This day marks the day when the last black slaves were emancipated in Texas. This is only 5 or 6 Phipps generations ago, if you're keeping on to our clock. Not that long. Hell, this day only became a holiday in 2021, last year. Okay, let's continue. Peg is only 7 or 8 Phipps generations ago. Not that long. Flip of the eye. A woman who was born into slavery, she was only 7 or 8 Phipps generations ago. So I get often asked this in my job capacity and in my personal life. Why do this? Why dig up the past? Why not just get over it? Let dead dogs lie, etc., etc., etc. Well, I hope I was able to illustrate in this brief amount of time that these events and injustices and limitations had an immense impact on my life and my family, as well as Peg's life, Peg's family, and her future generations. I'll give you an example personally. I, Jonathan Phipps, am the first male Phipps with a college degree. It's 2022. I'm the first to attain this college degree without having to rely on military service. This took 400 years, 13 generations. My mother and father and their siblings were the first Phipps to make it somewhat to what we would call middle class. But let me tell you, our middle class was a lot different from most other people's middle class. They were able to own a home, access somewhat fair and equitable health care, as Dr. Downing-Forget mentioned, somewhat. Assist their offspring into attaining that higher education I attained, and hopefully, knock on wood, one day retire. My dad's still working. That took 370 years, 12 generations. I'm a father of 1 son. I have another one on the way in August. Go me. Nervous. I'm naively hoping my sons will be among the first Phippses, not having to worry about the immense burden and impact history has on them. Sadly, I know this will not be the case. For every injustice, inequity, aggression, and lost opportunity I feel due to my race, and lost opportunities that I incur, I know those will be directly felt by my sons. It's just the way it is. My dad lost opportunities, I lost them in the process. That is a true power of history. Legacy. Legacy. I use this word often. I often ask myself, especially when I was younger, feeling more insecure, where would I have been, where the Phippses have been, where hell, even the whole country have been, if a mere 3 generations ago, we were truly equal and free, a mere 3 generations, that's all I'm asking, where would we all be? My family story is not unique. I can guarantee you every single speaker that spoke here has the same exact story. Guarantee it. This is why knowing stories such as Peg's are important. It allows us to conceptualize the important work that still, to this day, needs to be done. Be it in our schools, that's me, our communities, all of you, our workspaces, I'm assuming a good portion of you are still working, and yes, even our own personal homes. I hope the historical acknowledgement of Peg helps us understand not only how far we have come, which we should applaud ourselves for, but also how far we really have to go. Quite a distance. So for me, it is with this somber realization that Peg contributes to our advancement still to this day, and at least in my profession, she still does. The knowledge of how much work still needs to be done to ensure that, at least in my profession, our students are safe, secure, have equal access to opportunities, can be their best selves, learn their best lessons. But it also kind of is an acknowledgement and a somber reminder to me personally, be it the most recent incarnation, or the second most recent incarnation of the Phipps generation, how much work we still need to do. And with that, I'd like to thank Peg for that, primarily because that acknowledgement, though she is not here doing it in person today, nor in a diary, nor in a fancy documentary or anything like that, that legacy has an impact. And I hope we all take that legacy home with us into all of our circles with us. And that's all I have. So I believe I'm supposed to introduce, Thank you.
Thank you
Dr.
very
Martin
much.
Bowen.
Very briefly, thank you everyone for attending and participating today. Thank you all of our speakers. Thank you all of you for coming out and taking time to help celebrate Peg. I would like to invite you all to a reception at the museum immediately afterward, where you can view a number of the artworks created by students who work closely with Allery Ralph at the local elementary school as part of the Juneteenth celebration. And you will also have the opportunity to meet today's speakers and discuss with them the work that they are doing in the community, how you can help, and how you can give voice to other members of our community, both historic and living. Thank you very much. Have a good day.